Now, another thing that obviously came up when, it's been coming up, actually it comes up all the time. And, being in Task Unit Bruiser, people have heard that name. They've heard it, obviously around Chris Kyle. And I've been asked since the podcast started, can you talk about Chris Kyle? And the whole time I knew you were going to be coming on at some point, and I've been waiting to talk about Chris until you were here. And, people say, did you work with Chris? Did you know Chris? And the answer is yes. We absolutely worked with Chris and wanted to take just an opportunity to talk about Chris. And one of the things that I would like to try and do is talk about Chris, the Chris that we knew, right? The Chris that Leif and I knew, the Chris that the guys that are actually served with Chris knew, who is a little bit different than the Chris Kyle that's often portrayed in the movies.
For sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. And it's funny because people tell Chris Kyle stories, and he really is the legend, which I think a lot of people don't realize was a name that was given to him. That was his nickname, was the Legend. It was given to him in the previous platoon before we worked together. And I remember I met Chris at that time because I was with SEAL Team 5 and I deployed at the same time under the aegis of SEAL Team 3. And so we were there, and I remember meeting him in the talk. He'd just come back from Fallujah and doing some great sniper work there, and working with a bunch of our mutual friends, and so his platoon was in the Pacific Theater at the time, and he got a chance to go forward and be one of the few guys from the guys that were going to the Pacific that were selected to go to Iraq and actually be in the fight. And so guys were pissed. They were pissed that they were sitting there in the Pacific Theater training, some local national forces how to shoot, rounds on paper, and Chris was over there shooting bad guys in Iraq, and so they made this nickname, the Legend, for him, which was and it was very much in jest.
Yeah.
And so it's funny that as he continued to go on and do these great things, and now he's just this incredible larger life figure, he really is the Legend, and it's really. So when I hear stories or watch movies or hear people talk about it in a way, it's not the Chris Kyle that we knew. It's it's a superhuman. It's like a comic book hero. And look, the reality is, I think, having worked really closely with Chris, and he was our lead sniper and point man. Just so people understand that, in Charlie Platoon, I was the platoon commander for Charlie Platoon, which meant that on every patrol that we went on, he was walking about 8 or 10 feet in front of me. And that we talked all the time. We were in working about where we were going in, working together, and what areas we wanted to take down, what buildings we wanted to utilize. And he was a guy that really drove a lot of our operations. And so I knew Chris well. He was one of the three guys we had 3 guys that were on their 3rd platoon, and we called them the Triumvirate. And these 2 other guys are still active duty. I can't name them. They're outstanding guys. But these guys have been together for 3 platoons, 3 rotations, 3 deployments to the Middle East, to Iraq. And so we call them the Triumvirate, which is the Triumvirate is a term from the Roman era where you had a group of 3 people who share a position of power and authority. And these guys really drove, they brought up the new guys, they trained new guys, and got our platoon really where they needed to be. And we're kind of the heart and soul of the platoon. And Chris was, the real Chris that we knew and worked with was hilarious, number one. And that doesn't come across when you to a lot of people, that he was a guy who's just funny as hell. Always could crack a joke.
Sometimes when he shouldn't have been cracking.
Sometimes when he shouldn't have been cracking a joke. Yeah, but he was a guy that I think it almost does him a disservice to paint him in a way that was this superhuman, because the reason he was so successful at what he did is that he worked really hard at that and was very focused on it to really perfect his craft. And he, not only that, he delved into the planning. So we'd sit over a map and talk about where we wanted to go, look at different buildings and then we go on a reconnaissance patrol, which we had to run up through approvals through the chain of command for certain types of operations. But Jocko, as our task unit commander, approved our reconnaissance patrols, and
meaning that I could approve them, so they didn't really have to go up that chain of command. So it's pretty easy to get them approved for people that are listening that didn't quite catch that. Yeah.
So we'd say, "Hey, Jocko, we want to do this," and he'd be like, "Great." So we'd go out and we'd patrol through some really bad areas, and we'd hit like a dozen different buildings. Go in buildings here, check out observation points there, see what kind of roads we could see and access that we could see. So we'd figure out what gave us the best advantage, and then Chris would figure out where he wanted to be, and he'd put himself in that position. And so I'm looking down this window, I'm looking through this loophole in the roof wall, and he set himself up for success, which is awesome. Which is what made him so successful.
So, for instance, if the angle that he would pick from a building would be looking down the long axis of a road where he could see 400 or 500 meters worth of possible enemy targets, whereas another angle looking down a shorter road, maybe you can only see 80 meters, and you have a much smaller area to cover. Mm-hmm. So he'd pick these areas that he thought would be the most prevalent, the highest number of targets possible.
Of course, and that was, obviously that was how we made that's how we were so successful, and that's how we were able to prevent attacks on enemy forces or on enemy attacks on friendly forces rather. And so not only that, but when we go into these positions, Chris would be. He knew after the sun came up, first call to prayer goes down in the kind of early dawn, pre-dawn hours, and then the sun comes up and the city comes alive and enemy fighters are moving around. And, he'd be on the weapon when he knew that was looking down his sniper scope, when he knew that was the highest in the early morning, as the morning comes around, that 8 to 10 o'clock hour, that's when we knew we were going to get contacted. And, late afternoon was kind of the same thing. He'd be on his gun. And of course, he had to rotate out at some point. It's only humanly possible to stay on your gun for so long. But when he was on his gun, he looked down the scope of his weapon. He was very disciplined about that. I remember hearing some other guys being like, "Oh man, I only have 8 or 10 kills, and Chris, how's he got 85 now?" So at some point into our deployment, before it was completed. And, the reality is you'd see some of those guys were, we had 7 other snipers in our platoon, and they did a lot of great work, and they had some impact and certainly did great stuff. But a couple of those guys I'd see that didn't have the same discipline Chris had. They'd look down their weapon, and 30, 45 minutes into it, they're not seeing anything, or they haven't fired any shots, and next thing you know, they're kind of having a conversation with their buddy next to them. Next thing you know, they're sitting back from their rifle. Next thing you know, they're just kind of looking through binos. And I remember watching Chris, and he's just looking through his scope for 2 straight hours and without coming off of it. And it was, that enabled him to be successful, and that discipline really paid off. And certainly he was able to rack up the damage to enemy fighters.
No doubt about it. I know whenever I'd roll out to visit you guys in an Overwatch position, see everyone, and I would always notice Chris would always be on a gun. Like, I never saw him not on his gun. Of course, obviously, like you said, he's human and he'd take breaks, but I noticed that even on deployment, I'd just say, "Oh, Chris is on his gun." And
except for when you rolled in the Cop Falcon.
And he was crashed out sleeping with the rest of you guys.
So that was actually kind of a funny episode where we went in on boats and we snuck down. This is something Chris wrote about in American Sniper. We went in on the Marine Corps boat unit that was there. Was a great group of guys. They were awesome guys. And they took us very quietly down the river, canal that kind of comes off of the river. We were able to launch off onto the riverbank, very quietly foot patrol into the city, and get into an area that other people couldn't get into. It was super dangerous. The bad guys had no idea we were there, and we were able to take advantage of that. Smoke a guy or two on the way in, and then move in and take down the buildings that were going to be this combat outpost as the Army. They were following this giant mine clearance element coming down the roads, digging IEDs out. Jocko was riding in a Bradley fighting vehicle, braving some of the most dangerous roads in the world at the time. Coming in with the Army battalion staff there and as our command and control. And so we were already in. We'd been there for 3 or 4 hours at that point, maybe longer. And so we shot a couple guys, and we're a couple enemy fighters, and we still had guys in security positions, certainly, and guys on guns. But at that point, it was the IED clearance team was like right underneath us. I remember actually looking over the side of the building and seeing this giant Buffalo, this huge truck, armored vehicle with an arm on it, digging out of the street. And I know you were in a vehicle kind of coming in just behind that, a few vehicles up the road. You were maybe a few blocks away at that point. And I'm looking down, I'm like, that's like 30 feet below me, like directly below me right now. So if this thing activates an IED that explodes, like I'm going to take it right in the face. Probably ought to get down and stop looking at what they're doing. So we were just kind of hunkered down. And when Jocko came in there, it was funny because in particular, the Army operations officer for the battalion was a great guy, and the battalion was awesome. This was Task Force Bandit, a bunch of tankers, great guys. We loved them. They came in, and I remember you coming to the rooftop with a major, and he comes up there, and he's expecting just bristling weapons everywhere and all SEALs on their guns. And I'm looking over as the major's standing there and kind of looking around. And there's a couple guys on their guns, and there's some guys on machine guns and people watching the stairs.
Security was definitely set.
Security was set, of course. But I'm looking over, and Chris and our leading petty officer had just hammered down these like Chef Boyardee. They didn't want to eat MRE, so they just crushed these like he had like 3 or 4 empty containers of like Chef Boyardee meatballs.
Looked like a complete
and
slob.
It was just like spilled all over his uniform, and he's just like totally racked out, like completely asleep, slobbering on himself, snoring. And the major was like.
Is this man wounded? Yeah. It's funny though, because we would get in the preparation for those big operations. You'd be working so much doing the preparation, the coordination, and the planning that you wouldn't even stop for a day and a half or 2 days. And when you finally get in the field, you're tired.
Exactly. And we had to sleep. And that's when we had to sleep. When we knew we'd killed some bad guys, we weren't going to get attacked, or we were less likely to get attacked in the next few hours while it was still dark, we had to get sleep then. And so there was a real reason for that, because once the sun came up, we were going to get hammered. So we all had to be awake. We all had to be ready to go. So we had to get that kind of sleep when we could. And that was, that particular operation. I remember in particular, Chris, he just kind of had a good sense about things, because we were arguing over a building. I was standing on the rooftop, and I was like, okay, there's a big building to the south that would give us a good vantage point. Let's move down. What do you think about that building over there? I'm talking it over with him and with our platoon chief, Tony. And Chris was like, you know what? I like this building to the east. Let's go over there.
4-story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was pointing to 4-story. And I was like, I don't know, man. That building to the south looks pretty good. He's like, I think this building to the east is where we want to go. And we talked about it for a little bit, and I was like, okay, roger that. Let's go to the east. So we moved about 350 yards down the street to this big 4-story apartment building, and it was absolutely the right call. I mean, had we not done that, we would have, because it was, I think we had, what did we have, like 22 enemy confirmed killed from that over the next 48 hours.
That was prime real estate right there.
About a couple dozen, probable kills. So it was at a great advantage point, and we were looking right down a long axis road that was able to prevent a whole bunch of attacks on the U.S. soldiers that were building that combat outpost. And they were under fire the whole time. And as soon as the sun came up, I know you were sitting in the camp when those mortars came in, and and then lo and behold, so the mortars explode in the camp, and it's easy to just say, oh, mortars. But the reality was a gigantic explosion goes off, and we were 350 yards away. Fragmentation from that explosion was raining down on us from 350 yards away. So it was massive 120 millimeter mortars coming in, unfortunately killed a soldier, wounded a couple others. And within about half an hour of that, Chris smoked 2 guys out of like 4 that were loading a mortar tube into the back of a truck. So, when that's who Chris was, and that's the impact that he had, and he had a good sense about where to go and what to do, and he was excellent at it, and it was just awesome to work with him. He was so much fun to be around, and always quick with a joke, and that's the real Chris Kyle we knew.
And I'll tell you, just to go back to the fact that he, after. I was in the combat outpost. We take these mortars. Soldier gets killed. I remember and another soldier got wounded. I think in Iraq he got wounded as well. and it's a nightmare, right? These guys are bleeding out. It's a nightmare. And the thing, and we talked about this on the last podcast, of how helpless you feel against mortars. It's the worst. And talking about,
because they came from, maybe they could have come from 3, 4, 5 kilometers away.
And Eugene Sledge talks about it, and we talked about World War I and how bad it is. And so you have this combat outpost, and all the guys are on there. They're now horrified, right? You're scared. When is this next random bomb going to just blow up? We cannot be safe. And if you can imagine when I got word from you, hey, Chris just killed 2 guys with a mortar tube. And I went to, the company commander, and the brigade commander was down there as well, and said, hey, sir, one of our snipers just killed 2 guys with a mortar tube loaded into a truck. You couldn't do anything in the world better for them at that time. Nothing better in the world to walk into those guys and say, hey, you just lost a soldier to a mortar. We got him. And that was one of those things that just helped build our relationship with the conventional units so much. And you know what? We needed to have a relationship, because you could sit here and tell stories all day long about what they did in return for us, which was also just incredibly brave. And
that very same day we were calling QRF, and I know you were trying to move vehicles out of the way so we could get the tanks out there to our guys that were pinned down and needed help, and those tankers came out every time. Those soldiers were amazing.
You know, when Chris Kyle got those 2 guys hot, like how far away is that typically? Or is there even there's no typical, right?
That's the other thing too. When people talk about these sniper elements, well, first of all, they have to understand that it's in Ramadi, in downtown Ramadi in 2006. This was like Stalingrad. I mean, it was just rubble pile buildings. This was Al Qaeda in Iraq battle space. I mean, this is the precursor to ISIS, and it's the same people. Yeah. And there were several thousand of these guys that controlled the city, and it was just a nasty place. So we didn't go out in these little 2- and 4-man teams. We were going in with 15, 20, 25, 30 guys. Sometimes we had as many as 40 guys who were plussed up with Army and Marines that went in with us. And we always had Iraqi soldiers, but we didn't count them as part of our these are the guys going to help bail us out if things go down. So we had to have a big enough element that could prevent us from being overrun. And, if Chris were here today, I think he'd tell you, man, the only reason he was able to do what he could was because there was a huge team of guys supporting him. The guys carrying the machine guns in that were helping beating back attacks. And guess what? When you're attacked by machine guns and rockets from RPGs and you got a dozen enemy fighters maneuvering on you, you're not breaking contact with a bolt action
single shot sniper rifle.
You've got to have those machine gunners that are going to beat back those attacks, and that's what those guys did. So, without that whole team, and we were carrying our own shoulder fired rockets. Our leading petty officer was always a guy that would carry that big heavy 84 millimeter recoilless rifle over his shoulder, this big bazooka looking thing, and the heavy rounds for that. And it was we had to have that kind of firepower with us. So that was critical for all that we did. But most of the shots were pretty close. I mean, you're talking urban combat is, there wasn't a lot of real long range shooting. I mean, every once in a while I think Chris and Tony hit a couple guys from 1,500 yards or so out in a rural area.
Yeah,
I wasn't on that particular operation, but there was, but most of the stuff in the urban environment of downtown. I mean, we hit guys from as close as, I remember a couple times where one time in particular, me and Mark Lee and Chris were sitting in a room, and we look over, and there's some guys there's literally some moosh, like some enemy fighters with machine guns looking around the corner, and they're like 25 yards from us, like maybe 30 yards from us, and they're looking down the street. They knew we were in there somewhere, but they got the building wrong. Right. So you're talking a 30-yard shot there. With it, that's where a guy's coming. I think Chris ditched his sniper rifle, grabbed his M4, and shot those guys through the window. And then some of those shots are making a lot of them. I think the average was, I would say, probably anywhere from 100 to 300 yards, something like that, probably.
And you'd call that pretty close.
It's pretty close
for
to
300
for
right.
For sure. These guys that are trained to make 1,000, 2,000 yard shots, and so it's just a very different type of environment. And that urban combat is it's personal. You can hear those guys yelling at you. You can hear them yelling the jihadi regular. We're yelling back at them. You know, there's a lot of profanity going back and forth, but it's, you know, some of the stuff was hand grenade range, definitely.
Dang, and you call them what? Mooj? Is that what you call them?
Mooj.
What
is that?
That was
like
what we called the
derogatory
enemy fighters that we. So they call themselves Mujahideen, which is those engaged in jihad. That's their name for themselves, and so we shortened that to Muj.
And we actually got told that we weren't supposed to call them Muj.
Yeah, it's interesting how you can take a real name, shorten it, and it becomes derogatory.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing was we were told that it was derogatory and inappropriate to say Muj, and that it was disrespectful to the local populace. Mm-hmm. And when we talked to the local populace, you know what the local populace called the Muj? Muj. That's what they called them. Yeah. And so it's funny, we had the cultural experts telling us, when we were actually talking to locals and understanding what was happening more than anybody else at that particular time.
Yeah, maybe it was like offensive to them, though, you know, the actual Muj. Maybe they were offended.
We were not concerned about offending the Muj.
Yeah. You're all shooting them. You're shooting them, but the Muj, that's too much.
Another example of the big cultural warriors who just don't get it, don't understand it.
Yeah. It was
those local people were praying for us to go kill them, go kill the bad guys, and free them from this evil terrorist organization that is imposing this horrific, just brutal reign of terror on them. And so, I mean, it's exactly the same thing you see ISIS doing today, and we saw that over and over again in the city, where you go into a house and there's a family there, and they're trying just not to get killed in the crossfire, and they want your help, and they're happy you're there.
Dang.